and had in some ways been the justification for leading the United States into its proxy war in Vietnam.
The first point I would like to make is that if we were not already involved as we are today in Vietnam, I would know of no reason why we should wish to become so involved. And I could think of several reasons why we should wish not to.
You have referred to containment here. How can we contain in Vietnam?
But we would do better if we really would show ourselves a little more relaxed and less terrified of what happens in the, certainly in the smaller countries of Asia and Africa, and not jump around like an elephant frightened by a mouse every time these things occur.
Johnson was relieved when at the last moment, instead of airing Kennan's testimony, CBS showed reruns of The Real McCoys, The Andy Griffith Show, and I Love Lucy. But NBC kept the cameras running.
This is not only not our business, but I don't think we can do it successfully.
I take it by this you mean that this is simply not a practicable objective, as I understand it, in this country. We can't achieve it even with the best of will.
This is correct, and I have a fear that our thinking about this whole problem is still affected by some sort of illusions about invincibility on our part.
Just before the hearings began, the president had decided to resume the bombing of targets in North Vietnam. The 37-day pause that had begun on Christmas Eve 1965 had yielded no hint of Hanoi's willingness to come to the negotiating table. In South Vietnam, Viet Cong guerrillas were now believed to control nearly 3/4 of the country. But General William Westmoreland, the American commander, thought his most urgent task was to destroy the North Vietnamese regular army units Hanoi was sending south. Westmoreland's target for the next 2 years would be reaching what he called the crossover point, the point at which U.S. and ARVN forces were killing more enemy troops. American soldiers. They came from every corner of the country.
I was born at West Point when my dad was on the faculty there. From my earliest recollection, West Point was what I wanted to do. Not even particularly because I had an inkling or a strong desire for a military career. It just, West Point was kind of the height of my ambition.
The son of a colonel who had served in World War II, Matt Harrison had grown up on Army bases around the world. For him and his 4 siblings, the military was always at the center of their lives.
You addressed parents, sir and ma'am, and you said yes and not yeah, and you answered the phone, Colonel Harrison's orders. We got up every Saturday morning and we dusted the house. My dad would put on the West Point marching band, and my sister and I would dust around the living room.
It seemed to Matt's parents that he could do no wrong. He was the embodiment of the values they had hoped to instill in all their children: duty, honor, and country.
The strongest impression I have from my class and my classmates was they were guys who just were idealists. And I think guys gone from little towns all across the United States had that in common. It was a time before the questions about American exceptionalism. We didn't question. We believed in what this country stood for, and we believed that people who had the ability to lead soldiers should do that. I wanted to go with the gladiators. So I wanted to go with a tough guy. I was born in Boston, in the Roxbury section of Boston. There were those who would recruit you for gangs and try to entice you to do things that weren't. Let's put it like that.
Roger Harris dreamed of going to college on a football scholarship, but was not big enough to play for his team in high school.
And so I enlisted in the Marine Corps, and I felt that it was a win-win because one, if I died, then my mother would be able to receive the $10,000 insurance policy. I thought that was a lot of money. That my mother would be rich if I die, and she'll be rich. Job. Naive, dumb.
John Musk, Paramount neighborhood of Independence, Missouri.
I was 17, and my best friend and I went down and enlisted in the Marine Corps. I always dreamed of being a Marine. And I knew I wasn't going to be a man, but I was going to be a Marine, and that was enough. Doing something mature, and I'd be doing something that was important. And there was a war on, and I wanted a piece of it. I grew up in Perkins, Pennsylvania, and every Memorial Day, all that generation of World War II would dress up in their American Legion uniforms and parade around. And I'd put red, white, and blue crepe paper on my bicycle and ride behind the parade.
Bill Earhart would sign up in part because his father, a pastor, had not served. Earhart was a gifted student, and in his senior year in high school was accepted by 4 colleges. Had he attended any one of them, he would have been deferred from the draft.
It all came down to this notion of I was going to serve my country, be a hero, and have that gorgeous Marine Corps uniform. And the girls would just be draped around my neck. Nobody would keep me up again. But at the same time, I would really be serving my chance. One doesn't want to trivialize it, but it was my chance to be the star of my own John Wayne movie. It was my chance to do what that World War II generation had done and seemed to be so proud of. I had my turn.
Wherever they for their reasons for joining the military, training transformed them.
The first 5 weeks, I was convinced that I was going to die. The drill instructor said they were going to kill me. So I'd never met a black person until I arrived at boot camp. Stood next to a black person or a Hispanic or anyone who was Jewish. That's where I grew up. So that was just eye-opening. But when I got to talking to everybody, we were all the same. We were all working class. And we all wanted Marines real bad. By the time I graduated, I felt like I was Taylor Crow. I was God. I could do it. I did.
You know, the Marine Corps trains you to be a fighter. They train you to fight, they train you to kill. They say that if you're a Marine, you can't die until you kill 3 Vietnamese. And I said, well, for Roxbury, the expectation is 3. Now to 10. You know, craziness.
Okay. Power was its greatest asset, namely its firepower, destructive power, dropping a lot of bombs and shooting a lot of artillery at a distance. You kill a lot of them, you don't lose a lot of us.
The The central coastal province of Indian was home to more than 500,000 people. For decades, it had been a guerrilla stronghold. And in early 1966, the Viet Cong had been augmented by North Vietnamese regulars, some 8,000 men in all. General Westmoreland sent 20,000 American, South Vietnamese, and South Korean troops storming across the province in pursuit of the enemy and their sources of supply. They used leaflets and broadcast from loudspeakers to warn villagers of the terrible fate that awaited anyone who fired on their helicopters, urged them to leave their homes, promised safe passage for any Viet Cong who wished. Then they called in airstrikes and artillery and blew the hamlets to bits. It was the first large-scale search and destroy campaign of the war. The offensive lasted 42 days. The Army reported 2,389 enemy soldiers. Despite all the American firepower brought against them, most of the North Vietnamese regulars had still managed to escape back into the Central Highlands. The operation would drive more than 100,000 civilians from their homes. Similar search and destroy and bombing campaigns, 17 large-scale U.S. offensives in 1966 alone, would produce a total of more than 3 million homeless people all across the country, roughly 1/5 of South Vietnam's population. Since there was no front in Vietnam, as there had been in the First and Second World Wars, since no ground was ever permanently won or lost, the American military command in Vietnam, MACV, fell back more and more on a single grisly measure of supposed success, counting corpses, body count.
The problem with the war, as it often is, are the metrics. It is a situation where if you can't count what's important, you make what you can count important. So in this particular case, what you could count was dead enemy bodies.
You don't get details with the body count. You get numbers. And the numbers are lies, most of them. The body count is your success mark. Then you are pushing otherwise honorable men, warriors, to become liars.
If body count is the measure of success, then there's a tendency to count every body as an enemy soldier. There's a tendency to want to pile up dead bodies and perhaps to use less discriminate firepower than you might in order to see the result that you're charged trying to obtain.
Heavens of line in the South. I'm talking about bringing in people, equipment, supplies, and so on. They started from nothing and pushed a road through that, through an area the size of Massachusetts. And then maintained it.
Arms and supplies to the south of all. But when the U.S. Navy effectively blockaded the southern coastline, the North Vietnamese would be forced to move almost all of their supplies to Laos. Countries Hanoi. Americans called it the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Called it Route 559, after the men and women of the 559th Army Corps who were turning it from a braided web of footpaths into 12,000 tangled miles of jungle roadways, down which men and materiel streamed south. When they had fought the French, the Viet Minh had depended on tens of thousands of porters, then on legions of bicycles. Now, to offset the growing American presence, the North Vietnamese used more mechanized transport, relays of six-wheeled Russian-built trucks traveling under cover of darkness. MacVie reasoned that if the Ho Chi Minh Trail could somehow be sufficiently damaged, the enemy would be unable to sustain itself. 3 million tons of explosives would eventually be dropped on the Laos portion of the trail alone. 1 million more tons then fell on Germany and Japan during all of some key choke points were hit so many times, the workers gave them wings. Fried flesh and the gorge of lost souls. To expose enemy traffic, other aircraft dropped chemical defoliants, including Agent Orange, that destroyed thousands of acres of jungle and turned the earth into what one American pilot called phony lunar dust.
We'd punch a hole in the road and say, they'll never get around that one. And the next thing you come up and the hole wouldn't be there, and there'd be nothing in the trees back, 50 meters in both directions saying, heavy traffic all the way. Trước đây cũng có một người bạn Mỹ đã hỏi tôi là án tiết như thế tại sao ai giải quyết được? Cái thật thì mọi người tập trung dưới đất là đúng rồi. Mình không có gì trên trời đâu.
As many as 230,000 teenagers, many of them volunteers, worked to keep the roads open and the traffic moving. More than half of them were women. Lei Ming Kuei, who had left her home in the north with a novel by Ernest Hemingway in her backpack, observed her 17th birthday on the trail.
Tất cả mọi người thì ở một nước hôm nào ngày đêm như thế, chúng ta thấy thế nào mới có thể sống được. Thì lúc đấy thì chúng tôi nghĩ rằng là khủng khiếp lắm.
Thousands died on the trail from starvation and abstinence, fevers and snake bite and sheer exhaustion, as well as from the relentless bombing.
Không có lúc nào để sống. Thì họ phải đo thực tế và là phải có người để lấp xong một cái. Thì có khi vừa lấp xong thì bom Mỹ lại đổ xuống.
Và không thở, không đúng. Không còn gì. Một tin buồn rất lẹt, bóng đuông trời. Trong đơn vị tôi cũng có một số anh em của tôi chỉ là bệnh viện là do được mà sợ chết. Có những anh em là họ mà đi quanh ra Bắc. Có những đơn vị thu dung các anh em mới lại để mà lại tiếp tục huấn luyện giáo dục tuyên truyền vận động lại tiếp tục quay trở vào chiến đấu.
I couldn't pack don't tell anybody. But it was too much. I really didn't want to know.
Crocker had spent most of his boyhood reading about war, but nothing had prepared him for what he would experience in Cambodia. As a little child under work, he had his headquarters so bad that he had finally been reassigned to what he wanted most, a combat position.
Not hearing in those days was so difficult. There'd be at least 8 to 10 days usually between letters. So knowing he was in action, you just didn't know what, might be going on.
Mogi's battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Emerson, known as the Gunfighter, was courageous, implacable, relentless. A few months before Mogi got there, he had offered a case of whiskey to the first of his men to bring him the hacked-off head of an enemy soldier. They did. For 9 days in early May of 1966, Mogi and his outfit battled nothing but the terrain. They struggled through a labyrinth of elephant grass and thorn bushes, bamboo taller than 3 men, and triple canopy jungle so thick it sometimes took an hour to move 100 feet. The monsoon had begun. Sunlight rarely reached the forest floor. Finger-long black leeches caused wounds that quickly became infected. When Colonel Emerson learned that 4 companies of North Vietnamese were preparing an ambush, he decided to ambush the ambushers. On May 11th, he ordered his men to attack, backed by massive air and artillery strikes. Before the fighting ended, some 2,000 shells had slammed into the enemy positions. Blood was everywhere, pooled on the ground, smeared on leaves and grass and bamboo. There were scores of corpses, torn to pieces or blown into the earth, hidden in thickets, half buried in scooped-out graves. The earth-shaking concussions had blown the eyeballs of some of them from their heads. In the midst of the fighting, Mogi's squad was moving along. Enemy machine guns opened up on them. His closest friend was fatally wounded. Mogi crouched in front of him, radioed the suppressive fire, and then, as both machine guns continued shooting, he carried his dying friend off the battlefield. For his courage, he would be awarded the Army Commendation Medal. In his letters home, Mogi told his family nothing of what he'd seen or done.
One day when I was at the post office mailing something, I asked the clerk, how do they let you know if your son is wounded? It was very hard for me to form those words, but I just felt, I've got to know. I just felt so safe and anxiety. And don't ask that. Don't think about that. I said, well, I have to know. He said, don't worry, they'll tell you.
Oh, Sergeant, I'm a drafty and I've just arrived in camp. I've come to wear the uniform and join the martial band. And I want to do my duty, but one thing I do implore you, give me lessons, Sergeant, for I've never killed a
kids who may have been protesting because they didn't want to go. So they leave it to some guy that maybe got through 2 years of high school to go do it for him.
The war by 1966 ended at the middle class because the draft calls had to be at large. They couldn't get enough people to volunteer or draft people out of the working class. They started drafting people out of college. And that's when the anti-war movement shifted from a moral movement to a self-interest movement, driven by people who didn't want to go to war and their loved ones who didn't want them to go.
Bill Zimmerman was a graduate at the University of Chicago in 1966. The son of East, he worked in civil rights in Mississippi and had been opposed to American involvement in Vietnam since 1863. The draft was a consuming issue among men of Zimmerman's generation. Since 1942, every male citizen of the United States had been required to register at age. But of the nearly 27 million American men who came of age during the Vietnam War, more than half avoided military through exemptions and deferments. Nearly 500,000 Americans for conscientious objector status on religious or moral grounds, 6 times as many as in World War II. In all, 170,000 were allowed to perform alternative service in hospitals, homeless shelters, and schools. Some were sent to Vietnam. At least 2 Medal of Honor. Young men served in the Reserve or National Guard, but Reserve and Guardsmen were almost always white, generally better educated, better connected, and better paid than draftees. Interrupting their lives, President Johnson felt, would have increased opposition to the war. If you've got the dough, GI said, you don't have to go. The result was an army heavily skewed toward minorities and the underprivileged.
It's the backline, it's the backline. Just who you think I am. Raise my taxes, increase my wages, and send my son to Vietnam.
For a time, African Americans, though they represented only 12% of the population, suffered a disproportionate number of casualties. Resentment began to grow.
He got to do so much strength in building our community that if they come to get one person, they're going to have to mess with us all. That's what we got to do. That's what we got to do. We got to have so much strength so that when LBJ says, come here, boys, tomorrow, boy, we say, hell no, we ain't. My Negroes don't help. If I'm going to die, I'll die too, right here fighting you. If I'm going to die, you my enemy. My enemy is the white people, not the Vietnamese or Chinese or Japanese. You my opposer when I want freedom. You my opposer when I want justice. You my opposer when I want equality. And you want me to go somewhere and fight, but you won't even stand up for me here at home.
At first, 10,000 draftees were called up each month. But in 1966, the growing demand for fresh troops in Vietnam raised that number to 30,000. Now, thousands of college students could no longer expect a deferment.
And if your rank fell below a certain threshold, you were yanked out of college. Then the worst that could happen to you is you would be killed in Vietnam. So we protested at the University of Chicago that the university was complicit with this war by supplying switching to the draft board. We thought for the first time, we're really having an impact.
But a majority of Americans, old and young, supported the war. The young Americans for freedom